Hamilton Howard Albert Fish, born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish, was known by various aliases, including the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wysteria, and the Gray Man. Despite his diminutive stature, quiet demeanor, and unassuming appearance, Fish harbored a sinister secret life that would horrify even the most hardened criminals. From a young age, Fish exhibited signs of mental illness, a trait shared by several family members. His brother resided in an asylum, his uncle suffered from mania, and his mother experienced frequent visual hallucinations. Fish's father, who was 75 at the time of his birth, passed away when Albert was only 5. His widowed mother, unable to provide for her 4 children, placed them in a state orphanage. It was within the confines of the orphanage that Fish's fascination with pain took root. At the orphanage, he experienced a passion for pain. The caretakers frequently subjected the children to physical abuse, even encouraging them to hurt one another. While the other children lived in fear of the punishments, Fish found solace in them. He later recalled, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." The pain he experienced at the orphanage became associated with pleasure, which later evolved into sexual gratification. When his mother became mentally stable and financially self-sufficient enough to take him home in 1880, she removed him from the orphanage, but the damage had already been done. Fish continued to inflict pain upon himself and began an unhealthy relationship with a telegraph boy in 1882. The child introduced him to the sexual practices of urolagnia and coprophagia, the consumption of human waste. His sadomasochistic tendencies eventually led to an obsession with sexual self-mutilation. He would regularly embed needles into his groin and abdomen and flog himself with a nail-studded paddle. In 1890, after moving to New York City, Fish's crimes against children began. Fish's growing interest in the suffering of others led him to engage in immoral activities after relocating to New York City. He began exploiting himself and targeting young boys, enticing them away from their homes to subject them to rape and torture. A paddle adorned with nails was his preferred instrument of torment. In 1898, Fish married a woman his mother had introduced him to and went on to have 6 children with her. Despite never physically harming his own offspring, Fish continued to prey upon and torment other children throughout their upbringing. In 1910, while employed as a house painter in Delaware, Fish encountered Thomas Kedden. The two embarked on a sadomasochistic relationship, the extent of Kedden's consent remaining uncertain. In later accounts of their liaison, Fish would suggest that Kedden might have been intellectually disabled, although it was often challenging to discern fact from fiction in Fish's narratives. In just 10 days after their first encounter, Fish enticed Kedden to an abandoned farmhouse under the guise of a rendezvous. However, upon arrival, Kedden found himself trapped inside. Albert Fish eventually resorted to drinking his own urine and consuming his own feces. For 2 weeks, Fish subjected Kedden to torture. The budding murderer mutilated the other man's body. Then, as abruptly as he had appeared, Fish vanished, leaving Kedden with a $10 bill as compensation. "I will never forget his scream or the expression he gave me," Fish later recounted. By 1917, Fish struggled to hide the signs of severe mental illness, which led his wife to leave him for another man. His self-inflicted harm escalated, from inserting more and more needles into his groin to packing wool soaked in lighter fluid into his anus and setting it on fire. He also started experiencing auditory hallucinations. At one point, he remembered wrapping himself in a carpet on the orders of John the Apostle. Fish began teaching his children peculiar and disturbingly sadomasochistic games, eventually developing an obsession with cannibalism. As a prelude to consuming human flesh, he began eating raw meat, which he often encouraged his children to partake in. By 1919, the individual's fixation on torment and anthropophagy had led him to contemplate committing murder. He started seeking out susceptible children, such as intellectually disabled orphans or homeless black youths, whom he presumed would go unnoticed. He would assert at his trial and in subsequent writings that God was instructing him to inflict pain and consume young children. He scoured local newspapers for advertisements posted by families seeking someone to perform household chores or by young men looking for work themselves. This is where he found young Grace Budd. Grace wasn't initially Albert Fish's intended victim. It was her older brother he had initially set his sights on. Edward Budd was looking for work on a farm or in the countryside, which is why he placed the ad Fish came across. Fish initially planned to hire Edward and bring him to his rural home to torture him. Under the false name Frank Howard, Fish visited the Budd family in their Manhattan residence. He claimed to have some farm work upstate that needed doing, and he was also looking for some assistance around the house. Was Edward interested? Edward was considering accepting the job from the unremarkable gray-faced man. However, Fish's attention changed abruptly. As Edward contemplated the offer, Fish observed a young girl standing behind her parents, 10-year-old Grace. He devised a new plan and acted swiftly. While discussing his fabricated farm and the make-believe tasks Edward would undertake, Fish casually mentioned that he was in town to visit his niece and attend her birthday celebration. Would little Grace like to join him? Albert Fish, the seemingly ordinary stranger, managed to persuade Delia and Albert Budd to let him bring their daughter along to his niece's birthday party. Albert Fish brought Grace, dressed in her finest Sunday attire, to his upstate residence, the same one he had planned to use as a torture chamber for her brother. According to the letter he sent to Delia Budd, along with his confession, he hid in an upstairs bedroom, naked to avoid staining his clothes with blood, while Grace picked wildflowers in the yard. He then called her inside. When she screamed upon seeing him, he managed to grab her before she could escape. As his letter described, first, I stripped her naked. She fought fiercely, biting and scratching. I choked her to death, then cut her into small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. It took him 9 days to consume Grace Budd's entire body. Before his death, Albert Fish wrote a comprehensive account of his crimes for his lawyer, who chose not to share the writings due to their extreme horror. The letter, intended to instill fear in the Budd household, ultimately led to Albert Fish's downfall. The paper used for the letter was from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Police inquiries with the company revealed that the paper had been left behind by a janitor at a rooming house where he was staying. At the same rooming house, a man named Albert Fish was renting a room. Upon discovering that Fish closely resembled Frank Howard, Grace Budd's kidnapper, the police set up an interview. To their astonishment, Fish confessed immediately, eagerly providing precise details of his actions against Grace Budd and many other children. It was definitively established that only 3 children, including Grace, were victims of his actions. The Grace Budd murder is considered the most notorious of Fish's crimes. However, 2 other murders were connected to him after his arrest, which were equally horrifying. According to Crime Museum, Albert Fish is believed to be responsible for the murder of a 4-year-old boy named Billy Gaffney. Billy disappeared while playing with a neighbor in Brooklyn on February 11, 1927. A child who was with him at the time later told the police that the boogeyman had taken Billy. The 3-year-old boy described the boogeyman as a thin, elderly man with gray hair and a gray mustache. Initially, the police did not take the child's account seriously. However, when they searched the neighborhood without finding any clues, they realized that Billy had indeed been abducted and never seen again. After Fish's arrest, a motorman on a Brooklyn trolley line came forward to identify him as a nervous old man he had seen on the same day Billy disappeared. The old man was trying to calm a little boy sitting next to him on the trolley who was crying for his mother. The man then dragged the little boy off the trolley. Fish confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Billy in a chilling manner. I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. Despite the fact that Billy's remains were never discovered, the body of Fish's 3rd confirmed victim was found rather swiftly. In 1924, a tragic incident occurred on Staten Island when a young boy named Francis McDonald disappeared during a game with his brother and a group of friends. Sadly, his lifeless body was discovered in the nearby woods, and it was determined that he had been fatally strangled by his own suspenders. Prior to his execution, Albert Fish confessed to enticing Francis into the woods, where he assaulted and strangled the young boy. He claimed he was prepared to dismember the child, but believed he heard someone approaching and thus fled the scene. The trial of Albert Fish commenced on March 11, 1935, and showcased his insanity. As anticipated, his defense argued for innocence based on insanity, with Fish admitting that his auditory hallucinations, in the form of voices, instructed him to murder children. Although multiple psychiatrists involved in the trial advocated for an insanity plea, the jury ultimately deemed Fish sane enough to be found guilty. The trial lasted 10 days and concluded with a verdict that led to Fish's execution by electrocution the following year. Fish was executed on January 16, 1936. While awaiting his execution in Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York, Fish was allowed to write a series of notes about his crimes. These notes were intended to help reporters cover the gruesome case more accurately, with first-hand accounts that would likely captivate readers. It is generally believed that Fish killed between 3 and 9 victims, but he had a different number in mind. His chilling claim that he had a child in every state remains unverified. Furthermore, Fish's detailed prison recollections have never been released. Before his execution on January 16, 1936, Albert Fish's attorney, Jack Dempsey, refused to share his client's notes. Upon reading them, Dempsey determined that the contents were too horrifying for public consumption. "I will never show it to anyone," he said. "It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." I'd like to take this time to pay my respects to the victims and all the families that were affected by these heinous acts. May you rest in peace. You deserve better and are forever in our prayers. Conclusion. If you are ever unsure about whether or not you can trust someone, there are a few things you can do to protect yourself. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Do your research. If you are meeting someone online, do a little research on them before you meet in person. Meet in a public place. If you are meeting someone for the first time, always meet in a public place where there are other people around. Tell someone where you are going. Let a friend or family member know where you are going and who you are meeting. By following these tips, you can help to protect yourself from the dangers of trusting strangers. Remember, anyone could be a potential Albert Fish. It's always better to be safe than someone's next victim. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more Killa Cliff Notes, and I'll see you in the next one.